Really glad to have you joining us again for this really timely topic of responding to trauma as care providers. Now, we're really curious as we're getting started. And the title is, as you see, is Responding to Trauma as Care Providers. We're interested in what kind of care providers you are. I think it'll help Janice just to know who we're addressing in the room. So I wonder, as we get started, if you don't mind putting in the chat, and you're welcome to chat to me or to everyone in this, just what kind of care you're providing, whether it's just for teammates or friends, or what interests you in knowing how to respond to trauma. Is it a matter of being a member care provider? Are you just aware of what happens in the world and know that trauma is happening? Or yeah, so go ahead and put it in the chat if you don't mind. People that are joining us. So we've got a couple of responses coming in, looking at working with TCKs. Somebody's working with TCKs. Other people are supporting cross-cultural workers in general. There's member care workers for organizations, teachers, teammate and national colleagues in ministry, organizational care and member care, a child therapist in training, trauma aftercare provider in Iraq. So you're seeing all of these come into, I think, Janice, there's lots of people working in lots of team leader in an unstable environment, lots of people working in lots of unstable environments, or just with people in lots of different ways. And so there's a real need we could see in just about anybody that's coming here tonight, recognizing that they're dealing with people with trauma. So just a little bit of business as we get started. You're obviously aware that you can put things in the chat. I will ask as there's interaction, and Janice is presenting tonight. Ask questions that you send responses in chats to me specifically. That'll just help us to keep the flow of things moving well. We will also give you lots of different points to kind of interact with the material. Janice will, and so I think we'll all learn some things today that that'll be really interesting and helpful for lives in general. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Janice here, who maybe you've come across before. Janice Brauer is a counselor and member care provider herself for, I will never remember exactly how much time, but some decades here, working in multiple different countries and with people across quite a lot of spectrums of work and care. She's also on the board of Olive Tree Counseling Center, very much a friend to us, and we're really excited to hear from her tonight. So Janice, I'll turn this over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. Our topic for this evening, or today, depending on where you happen to be, is responding to trauma. And my goal is to help you be better equipped to come alongside someone you know who has experienced a trauma. So that could be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, someone in your faith community. It could be yourself. And we're going to be talking about responding as lay people. So the information that we're going to look at together is easy to understand and practical. It's certainly not an exhaustive look at the topic of trauma. We have experts here among our OTCC staff that can provide professional care for trauma recovery. But I encourage you, don't underestimate the care that you can provide and the difference that it can make. I also hope that the information we're going to share will be helpful to each of you personally. We all have hard parts of our lives with which we are coping, and we can all use a few more tools to help us manage well. Well, first of all, let's start with what is trauma? The word may conjure up images of victims of natural disaster or large-scale violence, and those certainly are traumatic events. But here's how we're going to define trauma today. Trauma is any deeply disturbing event we experience or witness that erodes one's sense of control and makes it hard to integrate what has happened with one's view of how the world should function. And Lisa, I see that our pictures are over the definition. Could you move us over to the left-hand side of the screen? I think for most of the slides, that'll be better.
Yeah, I think that's the case in my view, Janice. I think it might just be your view. So
okay, all right, good. I want to make sure people can see what we're talking about. Okay, so this is a very broad definition of trauma, and it means that many different experiences can be traumatic, and that's certainly true. Trauma can also cause a crisis of faith as one's theology of suffering and of the character of God is stretched. You may have heard people talk about big T traumas and little t traumas. Big T includes things like war and combat exposure, earthquakes or tsunamis, sexual assault, terrorism, violent crime, catastrophic accidents, or personal betrayal, such as marital infidelity or the death of a child. Little t traumas are things that push our capacity to cope and disrupt our usual ability to function in a healthy way. Little t traumas include things like interpersonal conflict, work or legal problems, change and loss, chronic health issues, stressful living situations, and long periods of bearing a burden or responsibility, to name just a few. Little t traumas are often overlooked or minimized, and yet they have a cumulative effect on a person. Whether or not an event is perceived as significant or traumatic can vary from person to person. A small t event may impact someone greatly, especially if it causes past issues to bubble up, or it feels like just the last straw of many things they're trying to cope with. So the bottom line is this: all life events leave a mark on us. It's not uncommon for people, global workers in particular, to downplay how events have impacted them. It's also tempting to compare our traumas with others. That can leave us either feeling like, well, gee, I really have no reason to complain after all, or that life is unfair and I have suffered more than others. But of course, the comparison game is seldom helpful. Your experience is your experience. Your feelings and responses are your feelings and responses. It's far better to allow yourself to be honest about those things and then to determine what can help you recover and heal and grow. Okay, a few more tidbits on trauma. You may have heard the terms simple trauma and complex trauma. Basically, simple trauma refers to a single incident event that has a clear beginning and end. Once the event is over, survivors find a place where they are safe and can begin to recover. Simple trauma may also be referred to as acute trauma. But don't be misled by the word simple. It isn't simple for the person who has experienced it. When a trauma incident is prolonged or repeated, it may be called chronic trauma, such as domestic abuse. Complex trauma, by contrast, is exposure to varied and multiple traumas with little or no time to find safety and recover. Complex trauma can also refer to children who experience multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature, that have wide-ranging and long-lasting impacts. So when they're talking about it with children, you might also hear the term developmental trauma. Well, the DSM lists criteria for various types of trauma responses, but for our role as member care providers, we can simply consider what are the common reactions to trauma. So they fall into different categories. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it gives us a really good idea. So first, our reactions that manifest themselves in our thoughts and attitudes. So Lisa, could you read those?
Sure can. Thoughts and attitudes include disbelief, confusion, poor concentration, hard to make decisions, hard to remember things, a distorted sense of time, cynicism, black and white thinking, or if onlying. There are also
And physical symptoms.
Yeah, physical symptoms, common reactions include heart racing, sweating, shortness of breath, chest pain, nausea or stomach pains, loss of appetite or food cravings, finding it hard to relax, being hypervigilant or easily startled, change of sleep patterns, and headaches and neck pain. And common reactions emotionally include being emotionally numb, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, anxious, agitated, sad, feeling helpless, feeling guilty, loss of a sense of humor, feeling unable to cope with life, and angry. Relationship effects include feeling really easily irritated or easily frustrated and sensitive to the people around you, feeling overly sensitive, experiencing more tension or arguments, feeling clingy, or avoiding intimacy. And it affects meaning in often a loss of a sense of purpose, loss of motivation, questioning someone's former beliefs, feeling disappointed with God, and staying busy with tasks so someone doesn't have to think about what's happened. Common behaviors include stopping formerly enjoyable activities, losing or misplacing things, getting overly involved in work, feeling less focused or less productive, using alcohol, drugs, or social media to numb, and inappropriate sexual behavior as well. In children, we see kids reenacting traumatic events through play. They might be experiencing frightening dreams, phobias, separation anxiety, increased irritability or anger, new physical symptoms, or just shutting down in general.
Thank you, Lisa. It's quite a list, isn't it?
Yeah.
What additional reactions to trauma would you like to add? What have you observed in other people or even experienced yourself? And even if it's something that's already been listed, but it seems, something that you see particularly often, or it's really strong in people. Let's share some of those in the chat, please.
Increased anxiety, burnout, accusations against God, flashbacks, assigning blame, needing to assign blame to someone. These are good.
Okay, thanks for those additions. Those are key and important.
Yeah.
But as we read through that list, you may have noticed that there's a lot of overlap between what a person may experience after a trauma and what they may experience while grieving or depressed or burned out. And I think that really makes sense because trauma and loss are so interwoven. So the purpose of listing these reactions is not to stick a label on someone, but rather to help them understand what may be happening to them in the aftermath of a trauma. So how could you use these lists? Well, you could share them with people and then ask some open-ended question. In the handouts, there's one page that lists the common reactions to trauma, all in one concise thing. Excuse me. So I just sometimes ask people to go through and circle the reactions that they've experienced, either currently or in the past. And then you can ask questions such as these. Have you experienced any of these common reactions, perhaps without realizing that they were connected to some trauma you've experienced? Does it help to know that these are common and they don't mean you're weak or crazy? And how frequently do you experience the symptoms you identified? How long have they been troubling you? How intense are they? To what degree are they interfering with your functioning? So gently exploring these questions can help you as a care provider better understand the person's needs at the particular moment. Normalizing reactions and providing psychoeducation about trauma can be quite helpful for people. But also be sure to share ways to cope and encourage small steps that, although they seem very ordinary, can really make a difference as someone recovers. So let's take a look at some of the ways to cope, some of the things to do and to not do. So Lisa, read these do's for us, please.
Yes, and just FYI, the handout will be coming through to the chat in just a minute, so no worries if you don't have it yet. So ways to cope. Some do's include relaxing and resting, eat nutritious food, exercise, get enough sleep, maintain as normal a routine as it's possible to do, limit exposure to troubling news, laugh when you can and cry when you can, and be kind to yourself and others. Do also practice daily gratitude, very powerful. Spend time with supportive people, talk about your experiences with safe people, write about your experiences, talk to God, listen or sing along with music, and accept that there will be good days and there will be hard days as well. Try not to make major decisions. Also, don't isolate yourself. Set up an active travel or ministry schedule. Don't speak publicly about sensitive details to a lot of people. Try not to drink alcoholic or caffeinated beverages. Don't take sedatives. And don't make broad generalizations about yourself, others, or the future.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, let's also put in the chat, what other ways to cope could you add? What are some do's or don'ts that you've found helpful or that you've seen others practicing and thought, that's really smart?
Getting outside into nature, someone said. Another person says memorize scripture. Staying connected to others. Hot baths or other kind of soothing activities. Art or creative expression. Gather a care group to check on you and pray for you. Journaling. Physical activity. Maintain healthy routines. Get plenty of something. Sleep. Good one. Plenty of
chocolate,
sleep.
Probably.
I mean, there's lots of ways that sentence get in. Get plenty of. But sleep is the end of this one. Listening to truth-affirming music is another good one. Doing things that are generally enjoyable.
Those are great. And it's good to know that there's a whole wide array of things we can do. The tricky part is that for the traumatized person, they can't think of those things. So that's a really practical thing that you can do as a caregiver. You can even say, hey, let's go for a walk together if your setting allows that. And then, remind them and suggest things they probably already know. Then ask, how can I help you in this next week? That's different than, well, let me know if you need anything. How can I help you? And of course, only offer that if you actually have the margin to do it. We sometimes feel hesitant about starting a conversation with someone who's been through a trauma, big T traumas in particular, but little t traumas as well. We're just not sure what to do or what to say, what to not do, what to not say. And so these list of common reactions and ways to cope are tools you can use as starting points. And remember that your caring presence and listening ear matter more than anything else. And the type of care that you give to someone also depends on the relationship you have with them. If you already have a trusting relationship with someone, your care will be so invaluable in a time of crisis. And the timing of the care, what type of care you give at what point after the trauma, is very important as well. So let's start with looking at the kind of care that you would provide immediately after an event. And I mean the first, 24 hours, second, third day especially. But initially, what people most need after a trauma is what's called psychological first aid. This is an initial disaster response that aims to provide stabilization and safety for people who've been affected by a trauma. So PFA includes a safe place where someone can relax physically and have their needs provided for. That's why temporary shelters are set up and people bring in food and water and things like that. So practical help, food, water, sleep, and medical care. People initially need reassurance and support. Just, you're okay, you're safe, we'll take care of you. And then they need contact with a limited number of loved ones or other important people, because it's additionally distressing to be, say, perhaps in a shelter after a flood and to know that your loved one doesn't know if you're alive or dead. So that's part of psychological first aid. And I'd also mention that this need for safety and reassurance applies across experiences. So if, for instance, a whole community has experienced a disaster such as a flood or a hurricane or a tsunami, or if just one neighbor has been a victim of robbery or assault, they all need safety and reassurance immediately after the event. So separate from psychological first aid is critical incident stress debriefing. That's usually done 2 to 3 days after an event, often in a group setting with trained debriefers. And the goal is to decrease stress and enhance recovery. Perhaps some of you are trained in CISD or have even participated in it yourself. There is some debate about the effectiveness of this approach. And if that interests you, you can look at the website there, but that's beyond what we're going to discuss today. The psychological first aid training and workbooks, those are available online. And so that's just one of many sites at which you could find more information. Well, then what do you do after the initial crisis has passed? So let's consider things to do a little later, and I'm calling a little later 1 to 6 months out. Provide a safe place for someone to tell their story and share their thoughts and feelings. Listen without judging or probing too much. Remember that people may be ready to share the facts before they're ready to share their emotions, or they may want to tell you how they feel without wanting to recount all the details of what happened. And be empathetic as you listen, but guard your own reactions. Don't be overly alarmed. Don't say, oh my gosh, what a horrible thing. How did you ever survive? They might need you to be a calming presence that can hold their strong feelings for a time. And then you can offer psychoeducation, such as the common reactions and the ways to cope that we just talked about. And of course, gentle care and prayer, including permission to grieve and lament. And one of the handouts relates to lament. Of course, you want to encourage healthy coping, but Don't problem solve for people. Lead them to identify their own small steps forward and then encourage them as they do so. You also want to support people in the grief process, but don't rush them to find a silver lining. And the grief process is something we'll share as an additional tool later as well. And then you want to monitor their recovery. You can find various checklists online, or you could use the common reactions and talk about how frequently or intense they're experiencing those. And remember that trauma recovery, like grief, is an up and down, back and forth process. And many people recover well, given time and the supportive and safe environment that they need. And of course, you do want to refer to professionals when appropriate. And I think our Olive Tree staff could attest to that people experiencing trauma is one of the big needs, or at least a piece of the needs that people come with when they come to Olive Tree. Well, what would you add to this list of how we can help people a little later? What else do you think is helpful? What's been helpful for you, or what have you seen is helpful as you talk with people? So again, go ahead and put those in the chat.
Somebody suggests establishing an ongoing soul care program.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else says to listen more than once over a period of time. That's good.
Okay, thank you. I think I just want to encourage you that these are things you can do. You don't have to be afraid. Well, what if I open a can of worms or whatever? You'll know what to do as a conversation with someone progresses. There are lots and lots of resources on trauma and trauma recovery, but in an effort to be simple and practical, I've selected just a few as a sort of trauma response toolbox. And some of these are in your handouts that Lisa has shared, and others are just some websites. So I want to talk about it, a few of these, and if you want to open the handouts, feel free. Otherwise, I'm just going to describe them. And then after the webinar, when you have a chance to look at them, you can do that a little more closely. So the first,
sorry, Janice, sorry to interrupt you. That is in your chat now, the trauma toolkit handout, just included, so you can open that from your chat.
Thank you. The first 2 pages that you're going to see are common reactions to trauma and the ways to cope, along with suggested questions you could use with the 2 lists. And then there's also on the second page, other questions you could discuss. So I'll read just a few of these. What happened? How did you feel? What was the hardest part for you? What events have you fairly easily come to peace with? And which experiences are proving more challenging to work through? What helped you most during this time? How have you experienced God's care? And if not, how is that impacting you? And so again, take note of the what's listed on the bottom there. The questions that you would pose would depend on the person's openness and capacity at that time, and how you sense they're recovering in the trauma, from the trauma, what their current situation is, and the level of trust you have for them. So I provide these tools as something to be used, with wisdom and discernment. not as like, oh, I should go through all these questions. They're really just starting points for you. Okay, and then the next 3 resources are things that I have developed myself. And the first one is called, just a moment, Journaling Life's Challenges. Let's see, okay. And this is an exercise that helps people name both losses and gains associated with a significant event. I first put this together about 10 years ago for myself following a personal health crisis. After the physical aspect was under control, I knew I needed to work through the emotional side of what I had experienced. And this tool, along with a prayer partner and the gracious leading of the Holy Spirit, really helped me to do that. The next handout in there is called Pour Out Your Heart. And it's a reflection on some Psalms, and it can be used as an aid in lament and heartfelt prayer to God. I think it's really important to give people the freedom to lament and not rush them to find, oh, well, Romans 8:28 says all things work together for good. We come to that point, but often through allowing ourselves to be in the struggle and the darkness for a while. And then the final thing in the handout there is called Encouraging Verses to Help Us Endure. And that's just what they are, along with a few reflection questions to help us see that God is present with us in times of trials. Well, let's go back up to this the second group of bullet points there, and those are available online. And I didn't copy them because of copyright considerations, but I'd like to describe those for you a little bit. The first one is called the State of My Soul Wheel, and it is a wheel illustration divided into 5 not quadrants, because there's 5 of them, like 5 pieces of the pie. Those 5 domains are emotional, physical, relational, vocational, and spiritual. And then in each section of the wheel, there's a whole bunch of descriptor words listed to help a person identify how they may be doing in this area. So it helps them name and identify how they're doing. And this is something that you can complete with someone individually, or you could do it together when you're talking with someone. You could do it even monthly or every other month or the 1st and 3rd and 6th month after a trauma, and see how they're coming along. It's a good self-assessment kind of tool. An individual use costs like $2.99 or something like that. So it's pretty simple, and you download it from the website. The Tangled Ball of Emotions is from Norm Wright, and it's often used in grief settings. It looks like a tangled ball of yarn all muddled up, and then there's names given to the many emotions a person often has in the wake of a loss. So there's threads that say denial, dismay, confusion, apathy, pain, fear, bitterness, helplessness, anger, and so forth. And I think it's a powerful visual because it just shows how all those things are so tangled up. And that you can download a PDF, you can find that online. And the final thing I think is very helpful is the grief process. And the one that I'm identifying there is from the Sharpening Your Interpersonal Skills workshop. I like it because I think it explains very well different parts of the grief journey. And it's particularly useful for believers because it was, developed by and for cross-cultural workers. And it also shows it very much not as a linear thing or just the valley that you sometimes see, but very much of a back and forth process, which is what often happens. And so the reason I think these grief resources are so helpful is because, as we mentioned earlier, trauma and loss and grief are so interwoven. All right, so let me describe these 4 other resources here. Trauma and Resilience is an excellent book on this topic, especially written for global workers. edited by Charlie and Frauke Schaefer, and that's on the final slide with the little more information given. The Trauma Healing Institute, you may be familiar with their course called Healing the Wounds of Trauma. That's a really excellent course. It's led by people who've been trained but aren't necessarily professional counselors, but it's a very helpful course. Multiplying Hope is an oral approach to trauma recovery for people who may be in settings with low literacy. The Tree of Life series is a 3 workbook set that helps people through the trauma recovery and then trains them to help others. And again, I'll have a little more about this on my the final slide that shows the resources. But what other resources might you recommend? What has been helpful that you've seen? Send those over to Lisa.
As you're typing your answers, I'll also just mention Kurt Thompson's website is a great resource for processing trauma and other difficult emotions. I believe it's just kurtthompsonmd.com. Somebody else suggests Thriving in Difficult Places, a book, I think, by Brenda Bosch.
Right.
Meeting with a Spiritual Director Who Has a Trauma-Informed Background is another suggestion. Great one. A book called Try Softer by Andy K. Kolber, I believe is the last name. I could be wrong on that, but K is the correct initial. Suffering and the Heart of God by Diane Langberg, and The End of Memory by Miroslav Volf. There's some helpful suggestions.
Yeah, those are great. Thank you so much. Well, let me see what my next slide is. Okay, later. So first we talked about immediately after, then we talked about 1 to 6 months, and now we're talking about later. So here are some tips for caring for traumatized as time goes on. You want to keep in mind that trauma can have lingering effects. Common symptoms of those who have experienced complex trauma are feelings of shame and guilt, feeling disconnected, having a hard time relating to others, increased anxiety and emotional arousal, avoidance, or numbness. Unresolved trauma can also show up in a variety of physical symptoms, such as a compromised immune system or chronic pain. So if you observe these things in someone, you might wonder if a person has some unresolved trauma or unprocessed grief. So don't jump to conclusions, but just gently explore that with someone. And then again, also be aware of the cumulative effects of trauma and loss. When a person has experienced one thing after another, they can end up in a very fragile state. And then also be aware that temperament, past adverse experiences, personal or inherited mental health risks, and neurobiological factors all contribute to how a person responds to trauma. So if you see other risk factors in someone, other things with which they seem to be continually struggling, just keep your antenna up, because they may have a little harder time recovering from trauma and may need some additional care. And so you can recommend appropriate resources, such as we've talked about and in the trauma toolbox, and so on. I do want to mention a little bit about trauma therapy when you do refer someone to a professional. There are different approaches to trauma therapy. One focuses on understanding trauma's impact and managing the triggers so that the person is free from repeated patterns or distressing symptoms. In that kind of approach, there isn't a focus on processing the trauma itself. Other therapy approaches talk about facing and overcoming fears, and others on, yes, processing the trauma in a variety of ways. So I'm just going to very briefly describe these. Lisa could do this much better than me, but here's a 2-sentence description. So cognitive therapy is talk therapy that helps people recognize ways of thinking that are keeping them stuck. Those could be negative beliefs about themselves, about the risk of trauma happening again. So for PTSD, cognitive therapy is also quite helpful and often used in conjunction with exposure therapy. And exposure therapy is a behavioral approach that helps people safely face situations and memories that they find frightening so that they can learn to cope with them. Exposure therapy can be particularly helpful for flashbacks and nightmares. One approach uses virtual reality programs to allow a person to sort of re-enter the traumatic circumstance. EMDR combines exposure therapy with a series of guided eye movements to help process or digest traumatic memories in the brain and thus change how you respond to them. I think most of our OTCC staff are trained in EMDR and testify to how helpful it can be for people. It helps people move beyond a flight, fight, or freeze response. And besides eye movement, you can also use bilateral sounds or taps, so you may hear people talking about that. Narrative exposure therapy is often used in community settings, and participants establish a story, a chronicle narrative of their life, concentrating mainly on traumatic experiences, but also incorporating positive events. And so the idea is that you're contextualizing the cognitive, the affective, and the sensory memories and sort of creating one coherent autobiographical story so that the traumatic memory is put in place, I guess you'd say, refined and understood and put to rest. And then play therapy is used with children. Actually, it can be used with adults as well, but very effective with children. So this is all kind of heavy, but I'd like to share about post-traumatic growth. So a final encouraging word is that life-changing positive growth can come through trauma. Not the trauma itself, but the process of struggling through it. You can probably think of many scripture verses that talk about how we learn, grow, and are transformed through trials. Post-traumatic growth doesn't mean everything is all better. Growth and ongoing distress can coexist, and I think all of us can attest to that. But reports of growth after trauma outnumber reports of psychiatric disorders, and I think that's very encouraging. Post-traumatic growth can be fostered by having a strong social support system before and after the event, by having spiritual resources, and by what is called acceptance coping, which is what it sounds like, accepting what has happened. 5 facets have been identified as common areas of post-traumatic growth. Greater optimism, and isn't that kind of ironic that out of a traumatic experience, a person could actually be more optimistic? Finding satisfaction in relationships, knowing that people matter more than anything else. An increased sense of personal strength, where inside you say, I can endure hard things. A renewed appreciation for life. How often you might have heard a cancer survivor say, I see each day as a gift. And then finally, spiritual growth. And certainly for us as believers, that's a beautiful outcome, that God can bring good growth, a deeper experience of his faithfulness to us through difficulties. So if you're interested in learning more about post-traumatic growth, you might want to check out the inventory that's listed there, and also the researchers and some of their items there. So finally, as caregivers, the help that you can provide, I think, is based on relationships and on resources. The relationship part includes your physical presence with someone, your willingness to sit and listen, and the countless ways you communicate compassion in someone's time of need. The practical part includes the resources we've discussed today, those that you've shared as well, used wisely and at the right time. They're intended to be tools, not fixes. Each trauma survivor is on a journey. You can walk with them, but you can't walk it for them. Still, your cares and prayers are so powerful. So may God use you to help those folks on a path toward healing and growth and peace. And I would be happy to hear comments, other insights that you have, other questions you have for myself or for Lisa.
Great time to pose your questions. That was a lot of really good information Janice shared with us. So I've shared the handout with you, and we'll also be sharing Janice's slides when we post this on the website soon. But now's your chance for questions or other helpful comments or information you'd like to include. It's just a request for a review of some of the physical symptoms people tend to experience. Can you elaborate more on when somebody is experiencing a traumatic event as traumatic? What are some of the physical experiences they tend to have?
Yeah. Okay. So heart racing, sweating, shortness of breath, chest pains, nausea, stomach pain, loss of appetite or food cravings, hard to relax, all worked up, hypervigilant, easily startled, change of sleep patterns, headaches and neck pains, and others as well. This is just a partial list, but I would say that some of them would be more prevalent, or you would see them more likely immediately after the event of a trauma, particularly the heart racing, the sweating, shortness of breath, things where you're really emotionally aroused. That would normally, you'd see that early on. It might happen later if a person is having flashbacks, or even as if you ask questions to someone, maybe a month out, they could start to experience some of these symptoms. And then you would want to back off, have them take some deep breaths, put a hand on their shoulder or knee or whatever, and help them calm down a little bit. Does that answer your question, or is there more that you're wondering about? Or Lisa, what would you like to add about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good overview. So much of it has to do with just what somebody experiences in the moment, and then what kind of continues on as somebody, a lot of that is very common in the immediate aftermath. And then really what we're looking at, what kind of stays with a person that might need to be addressed in some of the other ways that Janice has outlined.
Yeah, so it's the things like, nausea, upset stomach, not sleeping well, headaches, neck pain, all that. Those are things that would probably tend to linger a little bit more. So, a good intervention that we really didn't focus on much is helping the person calm down physically. Relax over a cup of tea, take a walk, turn down the lights, remove excess stimulation, those kinds of things. As you calm down physically, your brain has more capacity to remember and do things that are helpful for you.
Somebody else asked, what would you suggest for someone who has unprocessed grief? We've talked about the overlap in trauma and grief sort of processes. What do you suggest for someone who has had unprocessed grief?
Probably the first step is for them to talk to for them to come to a point of recognizing that. Because I think a lot of times the reason they haven't processed grief is either they don't wanna because they know it's going to hurt too much, or they've been, so inundated with the demands of life, ministry, cross-cultural living that they haven't given themselves the time and space to do that. So I think the first step really is helping a person see the need for processing the grief. And then you could start with some educational materials about the grief process. Just say, why don't you look at these? Let's talk about them. And again, processing grief is a big part of what the counselors at Olive Tree do.
There is a very helpful webinar on that on our site as well, dealing with grief. Another great question, how do you advise caring for those dealing with trauma who are not able to leave the setting in which trauma is taking place or has taken place?
Yeah, that's hard. That's hard, yeah. I just have a few thoughts and then I'll let Lisa add. Obviously, hopefully they can have a bit of a safe haven wherever they live. As safe, whatever safe means in their particular setting. So I would encourage them to spend a lot of time in their safe place and venture out for short periods of time and then come back to their safe place. Especially guard their children. And the other small suggestion is to provide as much what I call portable stability, as much structure and familiar comforting routines as you can, whether that's, prayer as a family in the morning, bedtime routines, eating meals together, that kind of thing. What else would you add, Lisa?
Yeah, I would say it'd be really important to lean hard into some particular coping skills to really do the work of figuring out what it is that's going to help, not that's going to necessarily change the traumatic situation if that's outside of somebody's control and they're not able to be removed from it. But to find some really helpful coping skills. I think this is something where mindfulness sort of activities can be really helpful. One of the ways that the body and the brain really tend to deal with trauma is to find ways to escape or kind of leave in some instances. Other ways is the body really kind of tends to flood, and that's where you get the fight, flight, or freeze sort of responses, and people respond in those different ways. So kind of lean into figuring out how your brain and your body maybe have a tendency to react to those sorts of traumatic situations, or the situation in which somebody can't remove themselves, and find specific ways to maybe counter or soothe some of those situations. And I wholeheartedly agree, Janice, with your the importance of finding some safe space. And for some people, that's depending on the situation they're in, it's a mental place. It's not even necessarily a physical place, but that's the power of the brain that God gave us. It's a really powerful tool for dealing with these things as well. Another question, is it advisable to evaluate someone for unresolved trauma if they'll be deploying to a high-risk venue with increased exposure to new traumatic incidences? So should you process trauma with somebody who's heading back into a traumatic place?
Okay, I maybe cut you off before you finish the question. The answer is, oh, yes. By all means, yes. I think there's this tendency in global servants to want to get and return to wherever they feel God wants them to be. And sometimes they do that to their own detriment and their long-term resilience by short-circuiting some of the growth and healing that really should take place in advance. And of course, different organizations will have different policies or approaches to that. But I think that's an excellent question. I think it's really important.
Yeah, there's several really good questions kind of along this vein, but somebody's asking about vicarious trauma. So any kind of notes on vicarious trauma. As someone providing care, you can be exposed to stories of a lot of trauma without directly experiencing it yourself. Do you have any tips specifically related to dealing with vicarious trauma?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And thank you for bringing that up. When you are in a caregiver role, you do experience that. And so, yeah, the common symptoms and the ways to cope, you could fill that out for yourself because you may be experiencing some of those things as a result. It's really helpful to have, I have found it helpful to have some kind of rituals, maybe too strong a word, but some kind of practice that helps you sort of shake it off and give it to God. And you can do that in a variety of ways. I think it's good to have, sometimes I do this physical thing where I just lift this concern, this burden I've just heard about up to God, and then I let it go. So I do that physically as well as in a prayer. And of course, it's very helpful to have peers that you can, one or two trusted people with whom you are free to share some of what you hear. That's a good way of releasing some of it as well. Don't go it alone.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll just add to that quickly. Janice, you said a while ago talked about how the comparison game is not helpful, and I think sometimes when we're dealing with vicarious trauma, we have a tendency maybe to say, well, surely my experience of trauma is not as bad. Just hearing about these stories as people who have actually experienced them, and thank God on one level that may be true, but it's not really helpful to minimize your own experience to what you're experiencing, the vicarious experience of trauma, especially as you maybe gather lots of different stories and painful things. So all of these symptoms and experiences can relate to people who are just hearing story after story. And there's questions along the lines of the Ukraine war. How do we deal with that as a collective, maybe even, and that's to recognize that we can all be affected by something that we're just hearing about or know people who are experiencing in neighboring countries or places, and we need the support as well to deal with those. And I think it's also just really important to say it's not selfish or minimizing somebody else's trauma to do exactly what Janice said, to let go of it, to find a way to set it aside at the appropriate time, not to just carry it around with you like somebody may have to if they've experienced it themselves, but to find a way to share it with other people, give it to the Lord, turn your attention to other things. It's not selfish, it's really healthy coping.
Yeah.
Sorry, little jumping on the bandwagon here.
Good thought.
Yeah. That is a question. Do you have any other thoughts, or what would you say about the trauma that lots of people are experiencing directly or indirectly, or in quite a variety of ways, such as the Ukraine war, maybe wars in the Middle East that people have been exposed to for quite a long time, or other places, things that are ongoing and haven't ended. There's not really an endpoint that's happened yet. Asking for your thoughts on that, or any directives or advice.
Yeah, I mean, that the ongoing trauma can happen, obviously in war and violent situations, in places that have incredible poverty, and that's always there. It can happen on an individual level for someone who's, getting chemotherapy for 5 or 10 years. So there's lots of ways that trauma is ongoing. And it's cumulative, the effect, it definitely is. So I'd say, the tools we talked about are still good. And I think what you're looking for when trauma is ongoing is it's not resolved. So you're looking for oases where you can experience some relief from it. And as Lisa pointed out, that can be a physical thing where you are able to leave the setting for a time, or it can be a spiritual or mental place inside of you where you can go. It can be a safe person that you're with that provides an oasis of relief and encouragement and a little bit of respite. Those just thoughts off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is the ability to hold both, right? Ongoing trauma or difficulty or hard things, and things that you mentioned that are coping skills like gratitude and joy and finding these oases. Especially in ongoing situations, we have to be willing to find a way to hold both at the same time, when and where we can. Another question, Janice, is for a request really for more resources to help deal with the question, where was God when I was going through this trauma? Is he real? How can you say God is always with us when something bad has happened? Do you have good resources you'd recommend?
I'll just recommend two books.
Yeah.
One is sort of a tried and true from many years ago, Disappointment with God by Philip Yancey. And then more recently, Scott Schaum's book, The Uninvited Companion, God Shaping Us in His Love Through Suffering, I think is a subtitle. A Grace Disguised by Jerry Sitzers, another excellent book. You probably could share many, but those are some of my favorites.
Another one that comes to my mind is called This Too Shall Last, by a name I'm not, Noomhold, I want to say is the last name, but it's a good one. KJ Ramsey, thank you. Somebody's familiar. Several people are familiar. Thanks, everyone. All right, any other questions for Janice? These are great questions. You guys have lots of good interaction. You can tell these are experiences that we have and have ongoing, helping people deal with ourselves deal with trauma. Excuse me. Come through and see if I'm missing. One more minute. Sometimes people are typing. There we go. Do you have tips for people who are working with others who don't believe in God, or maybe the same God, in dealing with trauma? How do you meet those people?
Yeah, most of the tools we looked at would cross any kind of faith tradition or lack thereof. And people could draw upon their own spiritual resources or understanding of God. I'm not exactly sure more specifically than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the books we were just listing certainly have a Christian perspective, but I mean, I think you're right, Janice. Most of the resources you've offered are not necessarily specifically Christian or enforce any kind of Christian worldview in order to be useful. So I think part of I don't know, I'm curious what you think about this. Part of the process of dealing with trauma can be that kind of making meaning from it, or figuring out how to make meaning from it. And obviously that might look different for someone who's not a believer in our God, but I think it's still a very human thing to want or need to do, to try to make meaning for it in somebody else's worldview and framework. And that's it's an acceptable thing for them to need to do. I don't know. Feel free to add on to that thought. But
well, you can certainly bring the love of Jesus in through your presence and your prayers that they know nothing about, that you're praying, right? But your presence, don't underestimate how God may use that.
That's good. All right. I think that feels like a pretty good place to wrap up. There's been lots of good interaction and questions here. We will be posting both the recording so you can review certainly what Janice has said here tonight, along with the handout and Janice's slides on the website by tomorrow or the next day. So if for some reason you didn't catch it from the chat, feel free to just get to the website in a day or two and you'll be able to get all of those resources. Thanks, Janice, very much for what you've shared with us today, for helpfully meeting us where a lot of us are at, which is helping people deal with trauma of a variety of
Yeah, and I guess my final encouragement would be, don't just put those handouts and the slides on a shelf. Even as a mental health professional, I actually review these. It's just so handy to have them more in the forefront of my mind as I'm listening to someone. So I hope you find them practical and keep them handy.
Yeah, these are very practical, and I would agree. They're not just things to be reviewed once and forgotten. Great to review. And so, yeah, thank you for providing the ongoing resources then as well, Janice. All right, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We are happy to have you with us, and we'll look forward to next time, which will be in July, as the next webinar, and hope you have a great day.